The sound of shattering porcelain echoed through the kitchen like gunfire, and Nora Neville's body went rigid as stone, her hands frozen in the empty air where the dinner plates had been just a heartbeat before. Her breath caught in her throat, eyes squeezed shut, shoulders hunched in anticipation of the fist that always followed such mistakes, the backhand that had taught her to fear every clumsy moment, every slip of her fingers. She waited in that terrible silence, counting the seconds, knowing that Clarence would rise from his chair with that cold fury in his eyes, knowing the pain that would bloom across her cheek like a dark flower. But instead of heavy footsteps and cruel hands, she heard the scrape of a chair being pushed back gently, the soft tread of boots crossing the wooden floor, and a low voice that seemed to carry the warmth of a summer prairie saying words she had never expected to hear in this house again. "Easy now, miss. Accidents happen to everyone." Nora's eyes flew open to see a tall cowboy kneeling on her kitchen floor, his weathered hands carefully gathering the broken shards of china, his movements deliberate and unhurried as though he had all the time in the world. He was not Clarence. The realization struck her with such force that she actually swayed on her feet, one hand reaching for the counter to steady herself. This man wore dust-covered denim and a faded blue shirt, a bandana tied loosely around his neck, and when he glanced up at her, his eyes were the color of whiskey held up to lamplight, warm and clear and utterly free of malice. "I am so sorry," she managed to whisper, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to control it. "I will replace them, I promise. Please do not tell him." The cowboy paused in his work, a frown creasing his sun-bronzed forehead. "Tell who, madam? And there is nothing to apologize for. These things happen." Before Nora could answer, the back door swung open and her employer, Mrs. Harriet Chen, bustled into the kitchen carrying a basket of herbs from her garden. The older woman took in the scene with a single swift glance, her sharp eyes missing nothing, and her expression softened with understanding that made Nora want to weep. "Jacob Vaughn, I see you have met my newest kitchen helper," Mrs. Chen said briskly, setting down her basket. "Nora, this is the ranch hand I told you about. He has been working the cattle drive circuit and just returned to Clifton Hill this morning. Jacob, this is Nora Neville. She has been with me for 3 weeks now, and she is the finest cook this side of the Missouri River when she is not worried about breaking my second-best china." Jacob rose to his feet, depositing the broken pieces carefully on the counter, and touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect that seemed as natural to him as breathing. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Miss Neville, though I wish it were under less startling circumstances." Nora could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She was still shaking, still caught in that awful space between expecting violence and receiving kindness, and she did not trust herself to speak without her voice breaking entirely. Mrs. Chen moved to her side, placing a gentle hand on her arm. "Why do not you go fetch some water from the well, dear? Take a moment in the fresh air. Jacob and I can finish cleaning this up." It was an excuse to escape, and Nora seized it gratefully, hurrying out into the late afternoon sunshine of this Missouri September in 1878. The town of Clifton Hill spread out before her in a patchwork of wooden buildings and dusty streets, the Mississippi River glinting in the distance like a ribbon of silver. She had arrived here 3 weeks ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and bruises hidden beneath her sleeves, fleeing from a husband whose fists had taught her that love could be the cruelest lie of all. Mrs. Chen had taken her in without asking too many questions, perhaps recognizing in Nora's haunted eyes a story she had heard too many times before. The older woman ran a boarding house for ranch hands and travelers, and she had given Nora a position in the kitchen, a small room of her own, and the first taste of safety Nora had known in 2 long years. But safety was a fragile thing, easily shattered like those dinner plates, and Nora still flinched at sudden movements, still waited for the blow that her body remembered even when her mind tried to forget. She drew water from the well with trembling hands, splashing some on her face, letting the coolness steady her racing heart. When she finally returned to the kitchen, Jacob Vaughn had gone and Mrs. Chen was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of stew with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything. "He seems like a good man," Mrs. Chen said without looking up. "Jacob, I mean. He has worked for various ranches around here for 5 years now. Honest, hardworking, does not drink himself stupid or gamble away his wages. The kind of man who helps without expecting anything in return." Nora picked up a knife and began chopping vegetables for the evening meal, grateful for the familiar task, for something to do with her hands. "I am sorry I dropped the plates." "Stop apologizing for being human," Mrs. Chen said, and there was steel beneath the kindness in her voice. "You are not in that place anymore, Nora. You are here and you are safe, and no one in this house will raise a hand to you. You understand me?" Tears pricked at Nora's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. She had cried enough tears to fill the Mississippi River, and she was determined to be stronger now, to build a new life from the broken pieces of the old one. "I understand." "Good. Now, Jacob will be taking his meals here along with the other ranch hands while he is in town. He is helping organize a cattle drive north to the railhead in St. Joseph, which means he will be around for the next 2 weeks. I trust you can manage to serve him dinner without dropping anything on his head." Despite everything, Nora felt a small smile tug at the corner of her mouth. "I will do my best." That evening, 6 ranch hands crowded around the long dining table in Mrs. Chen's boarding house, their voices a rumble of conversation about cattle prices and weather and the best routes north. Nora moved among them like a ghost, serving plates of beef stew and fresh bread, keeping her eyes down and her movements quiet. She had learned in her marriage that invisibility was a form of protection, that drawing attention only invited trouble. But when she set a plate in front of Jacob Vaughn, he looked up at her with those warm, whisky eyes and said, "Thank you, Miss Neville. This smells wonderful." It was such a simple thing, those words of appreciation, but they landed in Nora's chest like a small miracle. She nodded quickly and retreated to the kitchen, but she could feel the echo of his gratitude warming something inside her that had been cold for so long. Over the next few days, a pattern emerged. Jacob would arrive for breakfast at dawn, his hat in his hands, his manner always respectful and gentle. He never spoke over her, never made crude jokes like some of the other ranch hands, never let his gaze linger in ways that made her uncomfortable. He simply ate his meals with obvious appreciation, thanked her sincerely, and went about his business. And yet, Nora found herself increasingly aware of his presence. She noticed the way he held doors open not just for her, but for everyone. The way he listened when people spoke as though their words truly mattered. The way he moved with a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with aggression, and everything to do with a man who knew his own worth without needing to prove it. On the 4th day, she was in the kitchen garden picking tomatoes when Jacob appeared at the fence, leading his horse, a sturdy bay mare with intelligent eyes. "Afternoon, Miss Neville," he said, touching his hat brim in that gesture that was becoming familiar. "Mrs. Chen said you might need some help moving those feed sacks in the barn. They are pretty heavy." Nora straightened, brushing dirt from her apron. "I can manage them myself, but thank you for the offer." "I do not doubt you can," Jacob said, and there was no condescension in his tone, just simple acknowledgement. but there is no shame in accepting help when it is offered freely. I have got the time, and those sacks weigh near about 50 pounds each." She hesitated, old instincts warring with new possibilities. Clarence had always made her feel weak for needing help, had mocked her for any perceived inadequacy. But there was nothing mocking in Jacob's expression, just honest willingness to be useful. "All right," she said finally. "I would appreciate the help." They worked together in the dim coolness of the barn, Jacob lifting the heavy sacks of grain and stacking them neatly while Nora organized the smaller supplies. The silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward, broken only by the occasional comment about the weather or the boarding house. "Mrs. Chen is a good woman," Jacob said at one point, hefting another sack onto the growing pile. "She helped my sister once, years back, when Sarah needed a place to stay after her first husband died. Gave her work and dignity when she had nothing. I have never forgotten that kindness." "She is remarkable," Nora agreed softly. "She asks for nothing but honest work in return for shelter and wages. It is more than I expected to find when I came here." Jacob paused, wiping sweat from his forehead with his bandana. "You are from further east. I detect a bit of Kentucky in your accent, maybe Tennessee." "Kentucky," Nora confirmed, surprised that he had noticed such a detail. "I grew up on a small farm near Lexington. My parents both passed from fever when I was 17, and I married soon after." She stopped abruptly, not wanting to say more, not wanting to explain how that marriage had been her greatest mistake. But Jacob just nodded, not pressing for information she was not ready to give. "I am from Texas originally, but I have been drifting north with the cattle drives for years now. Clifton Hill is as close to a home as I have these days. It is a good town, good people. Do you ever want to settle down?" The question slipped out before Nora could stop it, and she felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment at her own boldness. Jacob's expression grew thoughtful. "I suppose I do, when I meet the right reason to stay in one place. The drifting life has its appeal when you are young and restless, but a man starts to want something more solid as he gets older, something real." He was 26. Nora had learned from the other ranch hands, which made him only 3 years older than her own 23 years. But there was a steadiness about him that seemed beyond his age, a groundedness that came from hard work and honest living. They finished organizing the barn, and as they emerged back into the sunshine, Jacob turned to her with a slight smile. "Would it be too forward of me to say that I look forward to your cooking every day? You have a real gift for it." Nora felt warmth bloom in her chest, different from the embarrassment of before. This was the warmth of being seen, of being appreciated for her skills rather than criticized for her failures. "That is not too forward at all, thank you. Well then, I will see you at supper, Miss Neville." He tipped his hat and led his horse away, and Nora stood watching him go, feeling something unfamiliar stirring in her heart. It was not love, not yet, but it was the first fragile shoots of trust, and that was perhaps even more precious. The days settled into a rhythm that felt almost peaceful. Nora woke before dawn to help Mrs. Chen prepare breakfast, spent her mornings tending the garden and doing laundry, her afternoons preparing the evening meal. The work was hard but satisfying, and for the first time in years she felt useful rather than useless, capable rather than constantly failing. Jacob continued to take his meals at the boarding house, and slowly, carefully, a friendship began to grow between them. He never pushed, never demanded more than she was willing to give. Instead, he offered small kindnesses, carrying her market baskets when he encountered her in town, fixing a loose hinge on the pantry door without being asked, bringing her wildflowers he had picked on the prairie with the simple explanation that they had reminded him of her garden. It was the wildflowers that finally broke through the last of Nora's carefully maintained walls. She was in the kitchen, her hands deep in bread dough, when Jacob appeared at the back door holding a bouquet of purple coneflowers and black-eyed Susans, their petals still dewed with morning moisture. "I thought you might like these," he said, looking almost shy in a way that made her heart squeeze. Nora wiped her hands on her apron and took the flowers, their simple beauty bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. "They are lovely. Thank you, Jacob." He must have noticed the tears because concern flickered across his face. "If I have overstepped, I apologize. I meant no disrespect." "No," Nora said quickly, clutching the flowers to her chest. "No, you have not overstepped at all. It is just that no one has given me flowers in such a long time." "They are perfect." The tension eased from Jacob's shoulders and his smile returned, warm and genuine. "I am glad. You work so hard, Miss Neville. You deserve to have something beautiful just for yourself." After he left, Nora stood holding those wildflowers and let herself acknowledge what she had been denying for days now. She was falling for Jacob Vaughn. It terrified her, this growing attachment, because the last time she had trusted a man with her heart, he had crushed it beneath his fists. Clarence had been charming too at first, bringing her gifts and speaking sweet words, and then the wedding vows had barely cooled before he had shown his true nature. But Jacob was not Clarence. She could see that in 100 small ways, in how he treated not just her but everyone around him with the same steady respect, in how he worked without complaint and shared credit for successes, in how he spoke of his mother and sister with obvious affection rather than the contempt Clarence had always shown for women. Still, fear was a hard habit to break. That evening, Mrs. Chen found Nora sitting on the back porch long after the dishes had been washed and put away, staring out at the darkening sky. "He is a good man," Mrs. Chen said quietly, settling into the chair beside her. "But you already know that, do not you?" Nora nodded slowly. "I do. And that is what frightens me most. I thought Clarence was good too at the beginning. What if I am wrong again? What if I let myself care and it all turns terrible, Mrs. Chen was silent for a long moment, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "I cannot promise you that you will never be hurt again, Nora. Life has no such guarantees. But I can tell you that Jacob Vaughn has been in this town for 5 years, and in all that time, I have never heard a single person speak ill of him. He has never raised his voice in anger, never mistreated an animal or a person, never broken his word. He is exactly what he appears to be, a decent man trying to live a decent life." "I want to believe that," Nora whispered, "but I am so afraid." "Then go slowly," Mrs. Chen advised. "Let him prove himself day by day. Trust is not something that can be rushed, especially when it has been broken before. But do not let your fear steal the possibility of happiness from you. You deserve love, Nora. Real love, the kind that builds you up instead of tearing you down." Those words stayed with Nora through the sleepless hours of the night, and when dawn came, she made a decision. She would let herself hope. Carefully, cautiously, but genuinely, the opportunity to act on that decision came sooner than expected. 2 days later, Mrs. Chen announced at breakfast that she needed to travel to St. Joseph to visit her ailing sister and would be gone for 4 days. She asked Nora to manage the boarding house in her absence, trusting her with the responsibility of caring for the ranch hands and keeping everything running smoothly. Nora threw herself into the work with determination, waking even earlier than usual to ensure the men had hot coffee and hearty meals, keeping the rooms clean and the supplies organized. It was exhausting, but also exhilarating to realize how capable she truly was when given the chance to prove herself. On the second evening of Mrs. Chen's absence, A fierce thunderstorm rolled in from the west, the kind of violent weather that made the whole house shake with thunder and turned the streets into rivers of mud. Nora was in the kitchen cleaning up after supper when she heard a crash from outside, followed by the distressed whinnying of horses. She grabbed a lantern and rushed out into the pouring rain, her skirts immediately soaking through, and discovered that a section of the fence around the small corral had collapsed in the wind. 3 horses were loose, panicking in the storm, and one of them was Jacob's bay mare. Without thinking, Nora set down the lantern and waded into the chaos, speaking softly to the frightened animals, reaching for halters and lead ropes. She managed to catch one of the horses, a gentle old gelding, and was leading him back toward the barn when she saw Jacob running through the rain toward her. "Miss Neville, get inside, you will catch your death out here." "The horses are loose," she called back over the roar of the storm. "Help me get them into the barn." Together they worked in the driving rain, calming the panicked animals and leading them one by one to safety. Jacob's mare was the last, having run the furthest in her fear, and it took both of them to coax her back, speaking soothing nonsense words while water streamed down their faces. Finally, all 3 horses were secured in the barn, and Jacob pulled the door closed against the wind. They stood there in the sudden relative quiet, both of them drenched and breathing hard, and then Jacob started to laugh. It was a rich, genuine sound that seemed to fill the whole barn, and after a moment of shock, Nora found herself laughing too, giddy with the absurdity of it all. "You are completely soaked," Jacob said when he could speak again, pulling hay from his hair. "So are you," Nora pointed out, wringing water from her braid. "True enough. But I am accustomed to getting caught in storms. You did not have to come out here, Miss Neville. That was brave of you." "Or foolish," Nora said, but she was smiling. She felt alive in a way she had not in years, her heart pounding not with fear but with exhilaration. Jacob's expression grew serious, his wet hair plastered to his forehead, his whiskey eyes intent on her face. "Not foolish at all. You saw something that needed doing and you did it, without hesitation. That takes courage." They were standing very close in the narrow aisle between the horse stalls, close enough that Nora could see water droplets caught in his eyelashes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body despite their soaked clothes. The air between them seemed to thicken with possibility, and for a moment Nora thought he might kiss her. But Jacob took a deliberate step back, respecting the boundaries she had not even known she had set. "We should get you back to the house before you freeze." That storm shows no signs of letting up. He was right. The rain was still hammering against the barn roof, and Nora was beginning to shiver. They made a run for the boarding house, splashing through puddles and burst through the back door into the blessedly warm kitchen. "You need to get into dry clothes immediately," Jacob said, suddenly all business. "I will stoke up the fire so you can warm yourself properly." Nora hurried to her small room and changed into her only other dress, a simple gray cotton that was worn but clean. She toweled her hair as dry as she could and returned to the kitchen to find Jacob had indeed built up the fire in the stove and was standing beside it, still in his wet clothes. "You need to change too," she said firmly. "You will catch pneumonia standing there in those soaked things." "My room is on the 2nd floor. I will head up in a moment. Go now. I will make us both some hot tea. It is the least I can do after you helped with the horses." Jacob hesitated, then nodded and left. When he returned a few minutes later in dry denims and a clean shirt, his hair roughly toweled, Nora had tea steeping and had set out some leftover biscuits and honey. They sat at the kitchen table together, the storm raging outside while warmth and comfort surrounded them inside. "Thank you," Nora said quietly, "for helping tonight. You do not need to thank me. We are partners in horse rescuing now." Jacob's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and Nora felt her heart flutter in response. Still, I appreciate it. You could have just secured your own horse and left the others. That is not who I am, Jacob said simply. Besides, you were already out there in the storm. I could not very well leave you to handle it alone. They talked while the tea cooled in their cups. Really talked in a way Nora had not with anyone in so long. Jacob told her about growing up on a ranch in Texas, about learning to rope cattle before he could properly read, about his mother who still wrote him letters full of recipes, and gossip even though he could barely manage to write back. Nora found herself sharing memories of her own childhood, of her mother teaching her to cook, of summers spent preserving fruits and winters huddled by the fire with books borrowed from the traveling library. She did not talk about Clarence, and Jacob did not push, but there was a moment when he said something that made her flinch involuntarily, some innocent comment about disagreements between husbands and wives. Jacob noticed immediately, his whole body going still. "Miss Neville, Nora, may I ask you something personal?" Her throat tightened. "You may ask. Are you running from someone who hurt you?" The directness of the question should have made her angry, should have made her defensive, but instead she felt relief wash over her. She was so tired of carrying the secret alone, so tired of pretending everything was fine. "Yes," she whispered. "My husband. I left him 3 months ago and came here hoping he would not find me." Jacob's jaw tightened, but when he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Did he hurt you badly?" "Badly enough that I knew if I stayed, he might kill me eventually. He never meant to, I think. He would always be so sorry afterwards, so full of promises to change. But the violence kept getting worse and the apologies kept meaning less. You were right to leave. You know that, do not you?" "You were absolutely right." Nora nodded, tears burning in her eyes. "I know, but I am still afraid he will find me. He has connections throughout Kentucky, business associates who might help him track me down. I chose Missouri because it was far enough away, because I hoped he would not think to look this far west." Jacob reached across the table slowly, telegraphing his intention clearly, and rested his hand palm up on the scarred wood. It was an invitation, not a demand. After a moment's hesitation, Nora placed her hand in his. His palm was warm and calloused from years of hard work, and his fingers closed around hers with gentle strength. "I cannot promise you that he will never find you," Jacob said quietly. "But I can promise that if he does, he will have to go through me to get to you. And I can promise that I will never, ever raise my hand to you in anger. Not now, not ever." "You barely know me," Nora protested, even as her heart was singing with hope. "I know enough. I know you are brave and kind and hardworking. I know you risked yourself in a storm to save frightened horses. I know you make the best biscuits I have ever tasted, and you hum when you think no one is listening. I know that when you smile, really smile, it is like the sun coming out after rain." He paused, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. "And I know that I have been half in love with you since the day you dropped those dishes and looked at me with such fear in your eyes. I wanted to tell you then that you never need to be afraid again, but I knew you would not believe me. I am hoping that maybe, after these past weeks, you might be starting to." Nora's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever spoken to her like this, with such honest emotion, such vulnerability. Clarence had recited poetry during their courtship, but it had all been performance, words calculated to seduce rather than expressions of genuine feeling. Jacob's words were plain and simple and utterly sincere. "I am starting to believe," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I am terrified, Jacob. I am terrified of making another mistake, of trusting the wrong person again. Then we go slowly, as slowly as you need. I am not going anywhere, Nora. I have spent 5 years drifting from town to town, never finding a reason to stay in one place. But you are that reason. You are worth staying for." The storm raged on outside, but in the warm kitchen, with her hand in Jacob's, Nora felt safer than she had in years. They sat there until the fire burned low, talking and occasionally lapsing into comfortable silence. And when they finally parted to go to their separate rooms, Nora carried with her the memory of his gentleness, his patience, his promise. Mrs. Chen returned 4 days later to find the boarding house running smoothly, and Nora humming in the kitchen with a lightness that had not been there before. The older woman took one look at her and smiled knowingly, but said nothing, for which Nora was grateful. Some things were too new, too fragile, to be spoken aloud just yet, but everyone in the boarding house could see the change. The other ranch hands teased Jacob good-naturedly about his sudden interest in spending time in the kitchen, offering to help with tasks he had never volunteered for before. Jacob bore their ribbing with patient good humor, his eyes always finding Nora across the room, checking without words that she was comfortable with his presence. They began taking walks together in the evening after her work was done, strolling along the bluffs above the Mississippi River while the sun set in glorious shades of orange and pink. Jacob talked about his dreams of someday owning his own ranch, not a huge operation but something manageable, a place where he could raise good cattle and better horses. Nora shared her own quiet hopes, dreams she had barely let herself acknowledge. A kitchen of her own, children to cook for and care for, a life built on respect rather than fear. "That sounds like a good life," Jacob said one evening as they stood watching the river flow past, wide and eternal. "It sounds like the kind of life we could build together if you were willing." Nora turned to look at him, at this man who had shown her what goodness looked like, what true strength was. "Are you asking me to marry you, Jacob Vaughn?" "Not yet," he said honestly. "I know you need more time and I want to court you properly, the way you deserve. But I am saying that I hope to ask you someday when you are ready to say yes." "And if I am never ready?" Nora had to ask, had to test the depths of his commitment. Jacob met her eyes steadily. "Then I will be honored to be your friend for as long as you will have me. I want you in my life, Nora, in whatever capacity you are comfortable with. Your happiness matters more to me than my own wishes." It was the right answer, the only answer that could have truly reached her. And in that moment, standing on the bluff with the wind in her hair and Jacob's steady presence beside her, Nora felt the last of her walls begin to crumble. "Ask me at Christmas," she said impulsively. "If we both still feel the same way at Christmas, ask me then." Joy blazed across Jacob's face like sunrise. "I will. I promise I will." The weeks that followed were the happiest Nora had known in years. Jacob was true to his word about courting her properly, bringing her small gifts he purchased with his wages. A new apron with embroidered flowers, a book of poems by Walt Whitman, a beautiful shawl in deep blue wool. They spent every spare moment together, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing in companionable silence while they worked. Jacob taught Nora to ride his bay mare, patient and encouraging as she learned to move with the horse's gait, to trust the animal beneath her. Nora taught Jacob to make his mother's favorite apple pie, laughing at his clumsy attempts to crimp the crust, but praising his persistence. They discovered shared loves, the smell of rain on dry earth, the sound of meadowlarks in the morning, the taste of wild blackberries picked straight from the bush. And slowly, carefully, Nora led him into the damaged places of her heart. She told him about the first time Clarence had hit her, 6 weeks into their marriage, and how she had made excuses for him, convinced herself it was her fault. She told him about the isolation, how Clarence had systematically cut her off from friends and family until she had no one to turn to. She told him about the final night, when Clarence had come home drunk and angry, and she had finally understood that if she did not leave, she would die in that house. Jacob listened to all of it without interrupting, his face a mask of controlled fury that was never, ever directed at her. When she finished, he simply pulled her into his arms and held her while she cried, and that wordless comfort meant more than any promises could have. October turned to November, and the weather grew colder. Jacob completed the organization of his cattle drive and spent 3 weeks on the trail to St. Joseph, and Nora found herself counting the days until his return with an intensity that would have frightened her once. But she had learned to trust this feeling, to believe that love did not have to be a trap. When Jacob finally rode back into Clifton Hill on a gray afternoon in late November, Nora was in the garden digging up the last of the root vegetables. She heard the hoofbeats and looked up to see him dismounting in front of the boarding house, and her heart leaped with pure joy. She dropped her trowel and ran to him without thinking, and Jacob caught her up in his arms, lifting her clear off the ground in an embrace that felt like coming home. "I missed you," he said against her hair. "Every mile of that journey I missed you." "I missed you too," Nora admitted, no longer afraid to speak her truth. "The days felt so long without you here." He set her down gently but did not let her go, his hands resting on her waist, his eyes searching her face. "I have been thinking while I was away. About us, about the future. And I know I said I would wait until Christmas to ask, but Nora, I need you to know something. I love you. I am completely, hopelessly in love with you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that love can be good and safe and true." Tears spilled down Nora's cheeks, but they were happy tears, tears of relief and joy and overwhelming gratitude. "I love you too, Jacob. I think I have loved you since the day you picked up those broken dishes and did not blame me for dropping them." "Then marry me," Jacob said urgently. "Not today, not tomorrow if you are not ready, but someday soon. Marry me and let me show you every single day how precious you are to me." "Yes," Nora said, the word bursting from her like a song. "Yes, Jacob, I will marry you." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and reverent, and Nora felt the last shadows of her past finally release their grip on her heart. This was what love was supposed to be. Chosen and cherished, gentle and strong, a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. They were married on a cold, bright December morning in the small church on Main Street with Mrs. Chen serving as Nora's matron of honor, and Jacob's sister Sarah traveling from Kansas City to stand up with her brother. It was a simple ceremony, no fancy frills or elaborate decorations. Just two people making promises they intended to keep in front of God and witnesses who genuinely cared for them. Nora wore a dress of ivory wool that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, simple but elegant, and she carried a bouquet of evergreen branches tied with ribbon since no flowers grew in the Missouri December. Jacob wore his best suit, his hair neatly combed, his eyes shining with happiness as Nora walked down the aisle toward him. When the preacher asked if any person objected to the union, Nora felt a moment of pure terror, half expecting Clarence to somehow appear and claim his rights as her husband. But the church remained peacefully silent, and she realized with dawning wonder that she was truly free. She had left Kentucky 3 months ago as a fugitive wife, but in Missouri, in this small town that had welcomed her, she was simply Nora, a woman choosing her own future. The vows they spoke were traditional, but they carried weight beyond the usual promises. When Jacob pledged to honor and cherish her, Nora heard the unspoken promise that he would never harm her. When she vowed to love and respect him, she meant that she would trust him with the broken pieces of her heart and believe he would handle them with care. They kissed as husband and wife to applause from the small gathering, and then everyone adjourned to the boarding house for a celebration dinner. Mrs. Chen had outdone herself, preparing a feast that included all of Nora and Jacob's favorite dishes, and the dining room rang with laughter and music as one of the ranch hands produced a fiddle and another a harmonica. Jacob led Nora in a dance, his hand warm and steady at her waist, and as they turned in slow circles around the cleared floor, he whispered in her ear, "Happy, Mrs. Vaughn." "Happier than I ever thought possible," she whispered back, and meant it with her whole heart. They spent their wedding night in Jacob's room at the boarding house, which would be their temporary home until they could afford a place of their own. Jacob was patient and gentle, attuned to Nora's needs and boundaries, and when she tensed at certain touches, memories of Clarence intruding, he simply held her until she felt safe again. Their joining was not perfect or practiced, but it was tender and loving, and afterward, as they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Nora felt a peace she had never known. "Thank you," she said softly into the darkness. "For what?" Jacob asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "For being you, for seeing me when I was broken and helping me become whole again." Jacob pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You were never broken, Nora. Hurt, yes, but not broken. You have always been strong. You just needed someone to remind you of that truth." The months that followed their wedding were a time of adjustment and growth. Jacob continued working for various ranches in the area, taking jobs that paid well and kept him close to Clifton Hill. Nora continued helping Mrs. Chen at the boarding house, but now she was also learning to manage her own household, small though it was, learning to budget and plan for a future that belonged to her and Jacob together. They saved every spare penny, dreaming of the day they could afford their own land. Jacob wanted at least 100 acres, enough for a decent herd of cattle and a proper house. Nora wanted a large kitchen with a real stove, a garden plot for vegetables and herbs, and a porch where they could sit together in the evenings. In March, Nora discovered she was pregnant. The realization came with mixed emotions: joy at the thought of starting a family with Jacob, but also fear born of her past. What if she was not a good mother? What if Clarence somehow found out and tried to claim the child? Jacob talked her through the fears patiently, reminding her that they were building a new life together, that the past could not reach them here. "Our child will grow up knowing nothing but love," Jacob promised, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "And you will be a wonderful mother because you know what children need: safety, affection, and the freedom to be themselves." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and into the summer. Nora continued her work at the boarding house until she grew too large and tired, at which point Mrs. Chen insisted she rest and let the older woman hire temporary help. Jacob fussed over her like a mother hen, bringing her cold water on hot days, rubbing her swollen feet in the evenings, reading aloud to her from the newspaper when she was too uncomfortable to sleep. In October of 1879, exactly 1 year after Jacob had proposed on the bluff overlooking the Mississippi, Nora went into labor. It was a long, difficult birth that lasted through the night and into the following morning, and there were moments when Nora was certain she would not survive. But Jacob stayed by her side every minute, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, telling her over and over that she was strong, she could do this, he believed in her. And finally, as dawn broke over Clifton Hill, their son was born. He came into the world with a lusty cry and a full head of dark hair, perfect in every way. Jacob wept openly as he held the baby for the first time, this tiny new person who represented everything good and hopeful in their lives. They named him Thomas, after Jacob's father who had died when Jacob was young, and he was a sweet-natured baby who rarely cried and seemed content to simply observe the world around him. Nora poured all the love she had been storing up for years into caring for her son, nursing him and singing to him and marveling at the miracle of his existence. "He has your eyes," Jacob said one evening as they sat together watching Thomas sleep in his cradle. "Same exact shade of blue." "And your stubborn chin," Nora replied with a smile. "I can already tell he is going to be as determined as his father." Life settled into a new rhythm, busier and more exhausting than before, but richer too. Nora had never imagined she could feel this fulfilled, this purposeful. She was a wife and mother, yes, but she was also still herself. Still helping Mrs. Chen occasionally, still tending her garden, still learning and growing. And Jacob was everything a husband and father should be. He changed diapers without complaint, walked the floor with Thomas when the baby was fussy, shared night feedings when he could. He never once made Nora feel inadequate or criticized her parenting choices. Instead, he supported her decisions and worked alongside her as a true partner. The autumn after Thomas was born, Jacob came home one day with news that made them both jubilant. He had saved enough money for a down payment on land. A rancher retiring from the business was selling 150 acres about 5 miles outside Clifton Hill, complete with a small house, a barn, and good grazing land. The price was reasonable, and the rancher was willing to hold a note for the balance, trusting Jacob's reputation for honest work. "We could have our own place," Jacob said, his excitement barely contained. "Our own land, our own home. We could build the life we have been dreaming about." Nora's heart soared. "Show me." They rode out the next day with Thomas bundled against Nora's chest, and when Nora saw the property, she knew immediately it was right. The house was small but sturdy, with a good roof and solid walls. The barn needed some repairs but was fundamentally sound. The land rolled gently toward a creek lined with cottonwood trees, and in every direction she could see nothing but sky and grass and possibility. "Yes," she said simply, "this is our home." They moved in 2 weeks later, their possessions pitifully few but their hopes abundant. Mrs. Chen gifted them household items she could spare: dishes and pots, blankets and towels, a rocking chair for Nora to nurse Thomas in. Other members of the community contributed as well, understanding that Jacob and Nora were hardworking people who would pay forward any kindness shown to them. The first winter in their new home was hard. Jacob worked long hours making repairs and caring for the small herd of cattle he had purchased, coming in each night exhausted but satisfied. Nora managed the house and Thomas, learning to cook on the temperamental old stove, learning to conserve supplies when trips to town were difficult in the snow. But they were happy. On the coldest nights, they would huddle together in their bed with Thomas nestled between them, and Nora would think about how far she had come from that kitchen in Kentucky, where she had waited for the blow that never came. She had traveled hundreds of miles and rebuilt her entire life, and it had all been worth it to arrive here in this moment, with this man and this child. Spring of 1880 brought new challenges and new joys. Jacob's cattle business began to show profit. Not much yet, but enough to prove the venture was viable. Nora started selling her baked goods in town, her pies and breads quickly becoming famous throughout Clifton Hill. Thomas grew into a toddler, walking and babbling and exploring everything with fearless curiosity. And Nora discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news brought only joy, no fear mixed in. She knew now what to expect, knew she could survive the ordeal of childbirth, knew that Jacob would support her through every moment. Their second child, a daughter they named Grace, was born in January of 1881 during a snowstorm that left them isolated on their ranch for 3 days. Grace was tiny and delicate where Thomas had been sturdy, with fine blonde hair and Jacob's whiskey-colored eyes. She was also more demanding, crying often and sleeping little, but somehow that made Nora love her even more fiercely. Here was a child who knew what she wanted and was not afraid to ask for it, a trait Nora hoped would serve her well in life. The years passed in a blur of work and growth. The ranch prospered under Jacob's careful management, the herd growing, the land becoming more productive. Nora's baking business expanded, and she started teaching other women in town her recipes, sharing the knowledge her mother had given her. Thomas and Grace grew healthy and strong, running wild on the prairie, learning to ride almost before they could walk properly. In 1883, Nora gave birth to their third child, another son they named David. He was a cheerful baby who seemed to find everything amusing, and his laughter became the soundtrack of their home. By this time, Jacob had hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work, and they had expanded the house, adding 2 more bedrooms and enlarging the kitchen so Nora finally had the workspace she had always dreamed of. Life was not perfect. There were hard seasons when the cattle prices dropped, years when drought withered the grass and they had to buy expensive feed. There were childhood illnesses that terrified them, accidents that could have been tragic, but by Grace were only frightening. There were days when Nora was so tired she could barely stand, days when Jacob came home so discouraged he could hardly speak. But they weathered every storm together, and with each challenge overcome, their bond grew stronger. Jacob never once raised his voice to her in anger, never belittled her contributions, never made her feel less than his equal partner. And Nora learned to speak her mind, to share her opinions, to take up space in her own life without apology. One evening in the summer of 1885, when Thomas was 5, Grace was 4, and David was 2, Nora stood on the porch of their ranch house watching her children play in the yard. Jacob came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "How lucky I am," Nora said honestly. 7 years ago I was running for my life, terrified and alone, and now look at us. We have this beautiful home, these amazing children, a life that is truly ours. Sometimes I can hardly believe it is real." "It is real," Jacob assured her. "And you earned every bit of it, Nora. You were brave enough to leave a terrible situation, brave enough to trust again, brave enough to build something new. I am the lucky one, getting to share this life with you." Nora turned in his arms to face him, this man who had saved her not by slaying dragons but by simply being kind, by picking up broken pieces without complaint or judgment. "I love you, Jacob Vaughn. I love the life we have built together." "I love you too," he said, and kissed her as the sun set over their land, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The children eventually tired of their playing and came running up to the porch, demanding dinner and stories and attention. Nora and Jacob obliged, herding the little ones inside, settling into the comfortable chaos of family life. They ate a simple meal of stew and bread, cleaned up together while the children chattered about their day, then gathered in the main room for the evening routine of stories and songs before bed. Nora rocked David to sleep in the chair Mrs. Chen had given them all those years ago, while Jacob tucked Thomas and Grace into their shared bed, listening to their prayers and promising them adventures tomorrow. When all 3 children were finally asleep, Nora and Jacob collapsed onto their own bed, exhausted but content. "Do you ever regret it?" Nora asked drowsily. "Taking on a woman with such a troubled past, You could have had someone easier, someone who did not come with all my fears and scars." Jacob propped himself up on one elbow to look down at her, his expression utterly serious. "I have never regretted a single moment with you, Nora Vaughn. Your past does not define you. Your strength does, your kindness does, your capacity to love despite being hurt so badly. You are the best person I know, and I thank God every day that you dropped those dishes." Nora laughed despite the tears in her eyes. "That is a strange thing to be grateful for. Maybe. But if you had not dropped them, I might not have seen how much you needed someone to be gentle with you. I might not have realized how special you were. So yes, I am grateful for those broken dishes, because they led me to you." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, and Nora's last thought before sleep claimed her was that she was finally, truly home. The years continued to unfold with all the messy beauty of a life well lived. There were more children. Another daughter, Elizabeth, born in 1887, and a final son, Michael, who arrived in 1889 and completed their family. The house expanded again to accommodate their growing brood, and the ranch prospered beyond anything Jacob had initially dreamed. Nora became known throughout the county for her hospitality and her cooking, and their home was always full of friends and neighbors stopping by for a meal or advice. She started a small school in town, teaching children to read and write one afternoon a week, giving back to the community that had given her so much. Jacob was elected to the town council, respected for his fairness and good judgment, and he used his position to advocate for improvements that benefited everyone. Thomas grew into a serious boy who loved books and learning, declaring at age 10 that he wanted to be a lawyer someday. Grace was spirited and fearless, more interested in cattle and horses than domestic pursuits, and Nora encouraged her daughter's independence even as she taught her practical skills. David was the peacemaker, always trying to smooth over conflicts between his siblings, while Elizabeth was quiet and artistic, spending hours drawing the world around her. Michael, the baby, was pure joy, laughing at everything and everyone. In 1890, when Nora was 35 and Jacob was 38, they celebrated their 12th wedding anniversary with a party at the ranch. Nearly 50 people attended, a testament to how deeply they had woven themselves into the fabric of Clifton Hill. Mrs. Chen, now in her 70s, sat in a place of honor, beaming at the family she had helped create by offering Nora sanctuary all those years ago. Late in the evening, after the guests had left and the children were in bed, Nora and Jacob walked out to the bluff overlooking the creek where they had once dreamed of their future. "You remember standing here and talking about what we wanted our lives to look like?" Nora asked, leaning against Jacob's solid warmth. "I remember," Jacob said. "You wanted a kitchen of your own and children to care for. I wanted land and a chance to build something lasting." "We got everything we wished for and so much more," Nora marveled. 5 healthy children, a successful ranch, friends who feel like family. It is more than I ever dared to hope for. You deserve every bit of happiness, Nora. You always did." She turned to look up at him, this man who had shown her what love truly meant, who had been patient when she needed patience and strong when she needed strength. "I was thinking today about that woman I used to be, the one who waited for the blow. She seems like a stranger now. I can barely remember what it felt like to live in that much fear." "You are not that woman anymore," Jacob agreed, though she was brave too in her own way. She survived and then she chose to live. That took tremendous courage. I could not have done it without you. You showed me that men could be gentle, that marriage could be a partnership rather than a prison. You healed something in me that I thought was permanently broken." Jacob pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We healed each other." "I was just drifting before you, Nora, never putting down roots because I had not found anything worth staying for. You gave me purpose and direction. You made me want to be the best man I could be." They stood there in the moonlight, listening to the creek babble over stones, feeling the summer breeze carry the scent of prairie grass and wildflowers. Somewhere in the house behind them, one of the children cried out briefly in their sleep, then settled. An owl called from the cottonwoods and another answered. The world was alive and beautiful, and they were part of it. In the distance, far to the east beyond the Mississippi River, was Kentucky, and the life Nora had fled. She had not heard from Clarence in all these years. Either he had given up searching for her, or he had found solace elsewhere, or perhaps he had died. She did not know and found she did not care. That chapter of her life was closed, its lessons learned, its scars faded to the faintest of marks. Here now, she was simply Nora Vaughn, wife of Jacob, mother of 5, member of a community she loved. She was a woman who had dropped dishes and learned she did not have to wait for the blow, because the right man would simply pick up the pieces without complaint or judgment. The years flowed forward like the Mississippi, steady and sure. The children grew and pursued their own dreams. Thomas did indeed become a lawyer, studying in St. Louis and returning to practice in Clifton Hill. Grace married a cowboy much like her father and started her own ranch in the next county. David took over a portion of the family land and became known for breeding excellent horses. Elizabeth moved to Kansas City to study art, then returned home to teach. Michael, the baby, decided to follow in his father's footsteps and worked the ranch alongside Jacob. Nora and Jacob aged gracefully, their hair going gray, their bodies slowing but their love remaining constant. They became grandparents, delighting in the arrival of Thomas's twins, Grace's 4 rowdy boys, David's daughter who was serious and studious like her father. More grandchildren followed, filling their lives with new purpose and joy. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1903, their children threw them a celebration that felt more like a town festival. The ranch was overflowing with people. Children and grandchildren, old friends and new neighbors, people whose lives had been touched by Nora and Jacob's quiet kindness over the years. Speeches were made, toasts were raised, and when someone asked Jacob the secret to a long and happy marriage, he looked at Nora with eyes that still held all the love of that first meeting and said, "Choose kindness every day. Choose patience. Choose to see your partner as an equal and a blessing. And never, ever take for granted the gift of sharing your life with someone who makes you want to be better than you are." Nora added, "And remember that trust has to be earned and maintained. That love is a verb, not just a feeling. That the small daily acts of consideration and respect matter more than grand gestures. We have been lucky, Jacob and I, but we have also worked hard at our marriage. It is the best work either of us has ever done." Mrs. Chen, now 91 and still sharp as a tack, raised her glass and said, "I remember the day Nora came to my boarding house, looking like a scared rabbit. And I remember the day Jacob knelt on my kitchen floor picking up broken dishes. I knew then that something special might happen if they both had the courage to try. I am glad I was right." The party lasted until well after dark, and when it finally ended, Nora and Jacob found themselves alone on their porch, watching the stars wheel overhead in the vast Missouri sky. 25 years, Nora said wonderingly. "Half my lifetime spent loving you." "The better half," Jacob replied with a smile, "for both of us." "Do you think we will have another 25? Jacob considered this seriously. "Maybe not 25 full years, but whatever time we have left, we will fill it with love and purpose. That is all anyone can ask for." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, hearts aligned. Behind them, their house stood solid and warm, filled with memories of laughter and tears, arguments and reconciliations, all the messy, beautiful moments that made up a life shared. Their land spread out around them, productive and peaceful. Their children and grandchildren were scattered across Missouri and beyond, carrying forward the values they had been taught. It was a good life, a blessed life, built on the foundation of one man's kindness and one woman's courage. Nora thought about that younger version of herself who had stood trembling in a kitchen, waiting for violence that never came. If she could speak to that frightened girl now, she would tell her that healing was possible, that love could be safe, that dropping the dishes was not the end of the world but perhaps the beginning of a new one. Jacob had picked up those pieces 13 years before their wedding, and in doing so, he had shown Nora that she deserved to be treated with gentleness. That simple act had changed the trajectory of her entire existence, had led her from fear to freedom, from isolation to belonging, from despair to hope. She squeezed Jacob's hand and he squeezed back, and in that small gesture was contained everything they had built together: partnership, respect, enduring love. The years ahead brought their share of sorrows. Mrs. Chen passed away in 1905, dying peacefully in her sleep at the remarkable age of 93. Nora mourned her deeply, this woman who had been mentor and friend and surrogate mother, who had given her sanctuary when she desperately needed it. They buried her in the Clifton Hills Cemetery under a headstone that read, "She gave shelter to the lost," and half the town attended the funeral. Jacob's sister Sarah died the following year after a brief illness, and Jacob grieved the loss of his last close blood relative. But they had their children and grandchildren to comfort them, and they found solace in knowing that both women had lived full lives and died knowing they were loved. The ranch continued to thrive under the joint management of Jacob and Michael, though Jacob gradually did less of the physical labor and more of the planning and oversight. Nora still cooked, though her daughters and daughters-in-law had taken over much of the daily work, and she spent her time quilting with friends, reading to grandchildren, and maintaining an extensive correspondence with people scattered across the country. In 1910, Nora turned 55 and Jacob turned 58. They were slowing down, their bodies reminding them daily that they were no longer young, but their spirits remained vital. They still took walks together in the evenings, still sat on the porch watching sunsets, still found reasons to laugh every day. That summer, on a warm July afternoon, Jacob was working with Michael to mend a fence when he suddenly stopped and put his hand to his chest. Michael saw his father's face go gray and caught him as he collapsed, calling frantically for help. They carried Jacob to the house, and Nora sent one of the grandchildren racing to town for the doctor, but in her heart, she already knew. The doctor confirmed it was his heart, weakened by a lifetime of hard work and now failing. There was nothing to be done except make him comfortable and wait. The family gathered. Thomas and Grace and David and Elizabeth and Michael with their spouses and children, filling the house with anxious vigils and whispered prayers. Jacob drifted in and out of consciousness for 2 days, and in his lucid moments, he asked for Nora. She sat by his bedside holding his hand, memorizing the beloved features of his face, trying to prepare herself for a loss she knew would shatter her. "I am not ready to let you go," she whispered to him on the second night, tears streaming down her face. Jacob's eyes opened, still that beautiful whiskey color even though everything else about him seemed faded. "I am not ready to go either, but Nora, listen to me. You have to promise me something. Anything. Promise me you will not let grief steal your joy. Promise me you will keep living, really living, and that you will tell our grandchildren about us, about how love is supposed to be." Promise me that you will remember you are strong and capable and worthy of every good thing." His breath was labored, each word clearly an effort. "And promise me you will know, every day for the rest of your life, how much I loved you." "I promise," Nora sobbed. "I promise all of it, and I need you to know that you saved me, Jacob. You saved my life by showing me kindness when I had forgotten it existed. Everything good in my life came from that moment when you picked up those broken dishes." Jacob smiled, and even in his weakness, it was his true smile, warm and genuine. "We saved each other. That is what love does. It heals and it saves and it makes everything better." He died just before dawn the next morning, his hand still clasped in Nora's. His children gathered around him. His passing was peaceful, a gentle slipping away, and Nora took comfort in knowing he had died surrounded by the family he loved, in the home they had built together. The funeral was enormous. People came from 3 counties to pay their respects to a man who had been unfailingly honest, hardworking, and kind. The stories people shared painted a picture of a life well lived. Jacob helping neighbors in need. Jacob breaking up fights with words rather than fists. Jacob treating everyone from the wealthiest rancher to the poorest drifter with the same genuine respect. Nora stood at the graveside and watched them lower her husband into the Missouri earth he had loved, and she felt as though part of her soul was being buried with him. But she also felt his presence, heard his voice in her memory telling her to keep living, and she knew that honoring his memory meant choosing life over grief. The months after Jacob's death were the hardest Nora had ever endured, harder even than leaving Clarence because this loss came from love rather than fear. She moved through her days mechanically at first, doing what needed to be done but feeling hollow inside. Her children worried about her, and her grandchildren tried to cheer her with their antics, and slowly, gradually, Nora found her way back to something resembling peace. She told stories about Jacob to anyone who would listen, keeping his memory alive through words and laughter. She continued the work they had started together, managing her portion of the ranch finances, maintaining friendships in town, baking pies for church socials. She poured her love into her grandchildren, teaching them to cook and sew and raid, passing on the wisdom she had accumulated over 55 years of living, and she kept her promise to Jacob. She did not let grief steal her joy entirely. There were still moments of happiness. A grandchild's first word, a perfect sunset, the taste of ripe strawberries in June. She learned that it was possible to carry sorrow and joy simultaneously, that missing someone did not mean she could not also appreciate the life she still had. Years passed. Nora moved into a smaller house on the ranch property that Michael and his wife had built for her, leaving the main house to them and their growing family. She became the matriarch of a sprawling clan, the keeper of family stories, the one everyone came to for advice or comfort or just a listening ear. In 1920, on what would have been her 42nd wedding anniversary, Nora made a pilgrimage to Jacob's grave. She was 65 years old now, her hair completely white, her body bent with arthritis, but her mind was still sharp and her heart still capable of love. She sat on the grass beside his headstone and talked to him as though he could hear her, telling him about the grandchildren and great-grandchildren he had never met, updating him on the ranch and the town and the world that had changed so much since his passing. She told him about the Great War that had taken 2 of their grandsons, about the women's suffrage movement that had finally granted her the right to vote, about the automobiles that now occasionally rattled down Clifton Hill's Main Street. "I have lived a good life," she told him finally. "I kept my promise. I did not let grief steal everything. But Jacob, I want you to know that not a day has gone by when I have not missed you. not a single day. You were the best part of my life, the greatest gift I ever received, and I am so grateful for every moment we had together." She placed wildflowers on his grave, the same purple coneflowers and black-eyed Susans he had brought her all those years ago. And she felt a sense of completion, of peace. Nora lived another 5 years, remaining active and engaged until the very end. She died in her sleep in February of 1925, surrounded by family, her last words a whispered, "I am coming, Jacob." She was 70 years old and had lived to see the 20th century transform the world she had known, but the values she had held dear, the lessons she had learned, remained constant. They buried her beside Jacob in the Clifton Hill Cemetery, under a headstone that read, "Beloved wife, mother, grandmother. She knew how to love." At her funeral, her eldest son Thomas told the story of how his parents had met, how his father had knelt on a kitchen floor picking up broken dishes and treating a frightened woman with unexpected kindness. "That moment defined their entire marriage," Thomas said to the gathered mourners. "My father saw someone in need and chose compassion. My mother saw someone offering help without expecting anything in return and chose to trust again. Together, they built a life based on mutual respect, genuine affection, and the daily choice to be kind to each other. They taught all of us what love is supposed to look like, and their legacy lives on in every one of us who tries to treat others with the same grace they showed each other." The years continued to roll forward, as they always do. The ranch was passed down through generations, remaining in the family for decades. The house where Nora and Jacob had raised their children eventually became a historical landmark, its kitchen preserved as it had been in those early days. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren scattered across the country, carrying forward the values they had been taught: integrity, kindness, hard work, and the belief that love should heal rather than harm. And sometimes, on quiet summer evenings when the light slants gold across the Missouri prairie, people swear they can see two figures walking hand in hand along the bluff overlooking the creek, a tall cowboy and a graceful woman, forever together in the land they loved. The story of Nora and Jacob Vaughn became part of Clifton Hill's folklore, told and retold until it took on the quality of legend. But those who had known them personally always insisted it was no legend but simple truth. Two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment, who had chosen love over fear, kindness over cruelty, partnership over dominance. Nora had dropped the dishes and waited for the blow, conditioned by abuse to expect violence. Jacob had simply picked up the pieces, showing her through one small act of compassion that she deserved better than what she had known. And from that moment, everything had changed. It was not a fairy tale with magical transformations or impossible coincidences. It was a real story about real people who worked hard at their relationship, who faced challenges and overcome them together, who built something lasting through daily acts of love and respect. It was a story about healing and hope, about second chances, and the courage it takes to trust again. And it was a story that ended not with a dramatic crescendo, but with the quiet satisfaction of two lives well lived. Two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, and who had created from their union a family and a legacy that would endure for generations. In the end, that is all any of us can hope for. To love and be loved, to build something meaningful, to leave the world a little better than we found it. Nora and Jacob Vaughn did exactly that, and their story serves as a reminder that kindness matters, that how we treat each other in small moments can change the entire course of a life, and that love, when it is real and true and based on mutual respect, can heal even the deepest wounds. The dishes were broken, but from those fragments they built a beautiful life together. And that, in the end, is the truest kind of magic there is.